What up, African world? It's your boy Home Team here. I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And today we're going to talk about the entire history of African men. So like my video on the entire history of black women, I can't go over, every black man in history. So I'm just going to go over and highlight some of the most significant black men in African history. Now this video is not going to be exclusively about history, but it's also going to be a philosophical review of African men and their descendants. So like as women, black men are also very diverse. We can pretty much characterize black men into three major categories based on major language phylum. You have the Niger Congo man, which is the black man's primary and most dominant language group. Then you have the Nilo-Saharan and the Afro black man. Black men's major civilization can be broken up by region. In West Africa, it was Wagadu, Mali, and Songhai. In Central and Southern Africa, it was Kanem, Congo, and Great Zimbabwe. And in Eastern Africa, he had Merowe, Egypt, and Aksum. These classical civilizations of Africa exemplify in part who the black man is and gives us clues concerning his nature. Upon studying these civilizations, you'll realize how different and diverse they all are, but more importantly, how his tremendous diversity impacted his story. You see, like all men, black men were never unified under any racial identity, but by ethnic or language group. But because the diversity of black men was so much more significant in size, this became in many ways his burden. The inherent beauty of black men and his greatness is his diversity, as it greatly contributed to the entire genetic fabric of our planet, literally building what we know today as a human race. But this greatness was also his weakness because, due to the gravity of his diversity, he was never able to consistently conquer himself, advancing a unified social or cultural political meaning amongst his brothers. Our goal today is to try and understand black men and their history. So what was the first black man like? What kind of culture did he develop? What were some of his first thoughts and ideas? Well, the very first significant cultural trait we see black men create is mummification, a culture that the world would marvel at thousands of years later. The first sign of complete mummification was called the Black Mummy, found in southern Libya. Scholars proclaim the boy was of sub-Saharan origin. You see, mummification is important into our understanding of the black man's first thoughts and ideas. Burying your dead in such a manner hints to the idea that black men knew there was something special about the human body and that somehow its preservation meant something. Later he continued to advance and evolve in his thinking, and his process of mummification became intrinsically tied to how he viewed the world around him. This, in essence, became a religion. Thus, it was black men who founded the world's most significant religious thought. Black men were the first men to consume and digest the idea of God, at times even elevating himself, and especially his women, to the level of a deity. His religion is what continued to drive his thinking and even advance him into a civilized human being as religion demanded it. He began creating structures like at Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, which was an astronomical observance, and according to some scholars began one of the first cultures of sculpture development. According to some scholars, the man who sparked this culture in Africa seems to have been the Nilo-Saharan black man, arising from sub-Saharan Africa. As this Nilo-Saharan man moved further north, his experience changed slightly, and he began to develop what would later be adored by humanity. Preserving the human anatomy in stone and even measuring our place in the universe through astronomical observance, expressing our importance as humans. Once you think highly of yourself and the human body, you must then create institutions to preserve and protect it. And it was this man that is believed to have founded the first significant civilization in Africa, Ta-Seti. This Nilo-Saharan black man is important to our understanding of the black man's first thought. And once we understand it, we realize he sparked what would later become a religion in African high societies. Now, the Niger-Congo black man seems to have been very different from his brothers. It was the Niger-Congo man that seems to have developed the most significant conquering spirit on the continent. As he apparently saw the need to expand his influence, he was the first to do this and was immensely successful at it, nearly taking the whole continent during the Bantu expansion. There is no doubt the Niger-Congo black man is the most dominant presence on the continent. In fact, even though there is no direct evidence of this, his expansion might be the very reason why we see Nilo-Saharan man further north. Given all of this, it would seem as though the Niger-Congo man helped to maintain and promote the matrilineal system of the entire continent, a system that his brothers seemed to embrace. He also seemed to be the first to train his brain with mathematics with the presence of the Ashango bone. Mathematics, of course, being one of the bedrocks of civilization. The ideas of the Nilo-Saharan black man seems to have been borrowed and further developed by the Afro black man. This Afro man seems to have been unique, as it was him that popularized the idea that the black man himself was God. He also popularized and improved upon the culture of his brother, the Nilo-Saharan, with writing, culture, and statehood. The Afro black man and his geographical proximity to the rest of the world assigned him with being the carrier of African culture and religion, exposing and introducing it to the rest of the world. Historically, it was his civilization that became the most recognizable and relatable to the rest of the world. So let's look at some black men in African history that exemplify the character of the Niger-Congo, the Nilo-Saharan, and the Afro-San. Sunjata Keita and Mansa Sakura of the Mali Empire are two examples of black men coming from humble beginnings, beating the odds and rising to the top. Sunjata was reported to be crippled and despised in Mali, but he defeated Sumanguru Kante, becoming the founder of the greatest empire in West African history. Mansa Sakura was literally a slave, starting all the way at the bottom and becoming the king of Mali. Shaka Zulu also speaks to the Niger-Congo experience. He literally influenced and changed the culture of an entire region, becoming the driver of a new culture, literally setting trends and changing the African space that he was in. The descendants of these Niger-Congo black men exemplify all these characteristics today. As black men in the New World suffered and survived the most gruesome act in human history, at times even gaining positions of power. But more importantly, he became the driver of culture in North and South America, setting trends that other groups of people began to mimic and even embrace. It's clear that the descendants of the Niger-Congo black man has inherited his characteristics. Even when he was robbed of his culture and identity, literally starting from the bottom, he began to recreate himself and start a new culture that still became irresistible to the rest of the world. King Narmer in many ways symbolizes the Afro black man. King Narmer was the first black man to create an empire on the continent. Even though it wasn't the first civilization, Egypt became the first significant empire in all of African history, an empire that led to great things. The Afro man's geographical presence along the coastal regions of Africa is significant. He was the first to introduce the black man's culture and ideas to the rest of the world. Ideas and culture that became very influential outside of Africa, and he is believed to be the first to branch outside the continent, hence the name Afro or Afro-Asiatic. Then we have the Nilo-Saharan. He did something that has never been done on planet Earth. What he and his predecessors did gives us valuable insight into understanding the natural core of black men, the color of his soul, which continues to paint all black men today. What he did in ancient times is the closest thing we have to understanding who black men are. The Niger Congo and the Afro black man did some things that can be seen throughout all men on the planet. But the Nilo-Saharan black man makes the distinction of all black men really clear. King Pi, the Kushite, went up into Egypt and conquered it, not to destroy it, but to revitalize and restore Nile Valley culture. The Kushites literally forgave their enemies and rebuilt the cultural and religious infrastructure of the Nile Valley, returning it to its African context. Never in the history of the world has any man conquered a region for the sole purpose of restoring their enemy's culture and worldview. Granted, it was a culture that the Nilo-Saharan Kushites believe belonged to them. But this very idea of forgiveness and restoration is unique. This one event exposes us to the core of all black men, how he views himself and the world around him. Despite the vast diversity of all these black men, the Niger Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Afro black men, there seems to be one characteristic that unifies them, or at least dominates their nature, their core. It stems from a subconscious belief seemingly inherent to all black men, the belief that he is morally superior, or in other words, morally responsible for mankind, as if he'd been assigned by nature itself. The same way the Kushites believed the Egyptian culture ultimately belonged to them, thus making them morally responsible for its corruption. So too does the black man subconsciously believe that he is the first man, creating the first culture and the first civilization. Thus, according to him, he is burdened with supervising the moral compass of mankind. Why? Because in his eyes, nature itself assigned it to him. This belief, ironically, causes a very peculiar disposition amongst black men, which we'll call moral complacency. A disposition in which he very rarely fights against. I'll explain a little later. So how does this moral complacency tangibly play itself out? Well, the Niger Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Afro never expanded outside the continent with the sole purpose of gaining resources and or wealth. The acquisition of land for black men had very little, if anything at all, to do with his feeling of worth or superiority. So ultimately, what is moral complacency, and how does it fit in with the story of black men? As black men left his home in Africa, he planted his seed across the entire planet. Every continent we look, we see pieces of his presence. But something happened that black men did not expect. He began to change due to his environment. In many ways, black men was shaping nature around him, and nature was loyal to him. But little did he know that nature was also shaping him. Thus, as time passed, the nature of his genetic, cultural, and spiritual seed began to be very different from what he remembers. This is the origin of his fear, but we'll get to that later. Black men descend from a continent with plenty of land and resources, so there never really seemed to develop a sense of urgency to survive and at times even compete. The key word here being urgency. Like mentioned before, black men were no strangers to diversity and language barriers amongst himself, but unfortunately, because of this, he assumed every foreign man he encountered had a similar nature to his own. One of his ills is his struggle to understand the motives behind other men that seek to destroy him, as he seems to have developed no need to genetically survive, as his genes and his subconscious opinion have been distributed throughout the entire earth long ago. And he also never developed an incessant need to feel superior to others, perhaps to his fault in a cosmic sort of way. In all men, he sees a sort of molecular piece of himself. This phenomenon, which I call moral complacency, seems to be unique to black men. Because of this, black men, especially today, largely succeed only as an individual. His greatness is seldom used to advance his own nation. Why? Mostly internal, but also some external factors apply, but ultimately because on a primordial level, he believes the world is his nation, as it originally belonged to him. His moral superiority has usually harmed him. That is his blessing and his curse, and though it provides him at times with cognitive dissonance, oddly enough, that is the only way he learned to be human. In essence, the only way he truly understands being human, and he feels burdened to teach mankind how to be like what he remembers, what he understands as human. The black man's greatest fear, no matter how irrational, is not that he will be annihilated, because to him that is simply impossible. The black man's greatest fear is coming to terms with the idea that the earth no longer belongs to him, that the earth abandoned its original creation, that he will not be the source of the earth's future evolution, that he will not be the source and the origin of humanity's next phase, that his idea of human is not what nature assigned it to be. This is why he remains morally complacent even when faced with the destruction of his own nation, because his moral complacency allows him to infiltrate himself in other nations, being the driver of its culture, becoming the ghostwriter for the social, cultural evolution of our planet. This is why he has no issue being successful as an individual in a society he did not create, because in his primal opinion, the earth will continue to belong to him, and he can continue to define what a human is. You see, back then, as he planted his seed across the planet in the beginning, he only saw himself and one version of humanity, but of course this has changed. This is not the humanity he has come to know and understand. Thus, in his moral superiority, he will do anything to remain the driver of what he feels humanity is, cultivating its culture and its worldview, even at the expense of his own nation. However, the question is his commitment to moral complacency worth it? In other words, are his fears of an unfamiliar humanity worth his nation? This is a question that black men are beginning to ask himself right now in the 21st century. What is the value of my moral superiority, and will nature continue to honor it? And when we, As black men finally answer this question, whatever the answer may be, it will greatly determine the social, political, and spiritual tone for the entire planet for the next 500 years. Why? Well, because black men have always been the spark of humanity's cultural and spiritual significance. He founded the first human moral codes. Let's really think about the subconscious of black men. Who was the first celebrated and well-known black man in African history? His name was Asar. And what did Asar concern himself with in life? The first thing that Asar did was teach others how to be human, how to be morally upright, and how to build civilization. This was the first championed image of a man that black men developed for himself. The first thought of black men, his first celebrated figure in his mind, advanced characteristics of teaching men how to be human, teaching them a morally proper worldview. And what happened to Asar? He was killed and dismembered, and later his wife brought his pieces together and wrapped it up in the first ever mummification process. For the black man, mummification exemplifies the importance of the human body, but more importantly, what the human body means and represents. The first man was morally upright, teaching the world the idea of what a man is and what a human is, and it was him who was the first to be mummified or preserved. To the black man, preserving this ideal man or ideal human is of utmost importance to him. Even though black men have been dehumanized and despised by all groups of non-Africans, ironically, he alone invented the human institutions that became the only thing separating man from beast: art, culture, and civilization. This tradition is continued amongst his sons. Non-Africans continue to obsess and absorb and even mimic the black man's art and culture, but despise its creator. But strangely enough, that's not even the black man's burden. The black man's burden is not that he is oppressed and forgotten. His burden is being the moral, cultural, and spiritual compass of the human spirit. His curse is that he constantly seeks validation from which he deems the first reflection of his creator, nature, which in his subconscious mind may or may not be loyal to him anymore. Despite his extraordinary resilience to the most gruesome act in human history, his survival and his patience with humanity is unrivaled. One of his greatest attributes, which in many ways became a driver for his survival, is his creativity. Black men have continually done things that has not been done by any man on the planet. It's a rather impressive accomplishment. As most men on the planet needed the sword to do so, black man has done it with his mind. Well, what is it? It's his culture. The culture of black men is the only thing that has genuinely conquered the world. And that has become his greatest weapon for preserving his idea of human. Well guys, I'm all out. I want to dedicate more time and attention to my videos, so I'm making the transition over to Patreon. All my videos are going to be on Patreon, including my full courses. So this is going to be the last African history video on YouTube. So if you guys are interested in learning more about African history, you can go over to my Patreon page and support the home team. I want to be able to get my projects off the ground and ultimately be able to commit more time to teaching African history, and support on Patreon will allow me to do that. To gain access to my vids on Patreon, you can give $1 a month, and for access for projects and sources, you can give a little more. I already have the full courses on Wagadu Empire, the Mali Empire, and I'm currently teaching the Songhai Empire. My next full course will be about Timbuktu, under the Songhai Empire. I recently posted a timeline of African history from its earliest times to 1914 in order of significant events. This is very valuable information into understanding African history and gaining a proper historical perspective. I want to further improve these full lessons and my regular videos, and also help those interested gain access to resources on African history. You can subscribe to the Patreon page in the description box below. It's your boy Home Team. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.